Chapter 9, Performance Management. Near the beginning of the chapter, Cascio talks about a survey of 8,000 employees, and 1/3 of those employees reported that their managers provided little or no assistance in improving their performance, and that they had never had a formal discussion with their managers regarding their overall performance. The word that comes to my mind when I read that is criminal, as in people who break the law. It just seems, obviously this isn't a legal issue, but that seems criminal. Unbelievably negligent managerial behavior. So that is completely unacceptable. Managers are busy, yes. They're fighting fires, they've got meetings, they've got to decide the strategy of the organization. They've got a lot of things going on. But managers are there to manage. And what they do is not only manage the numbers or the profits, they got to manage the people who get those profits or don't get those profits. So that is just deplorable and kind of outrageous, those statistics. So be sure that those would be a couple things that your employees would answer affirmative in the positive to, that you provide a significant amount of assistance in improving performance, and that you do have formal and informal discussions with them about their performance. So what managers must do is provide timely feedback about performance, as Cascio says, while constantly focusing everyone's attention on the ultimate objective. I really like that portrayal of the manager's role. So managers must provide timely feedback about performance while constantly focusing everyone's attention on the ultimate objective. So they keep the big picture in mind. Where are we headed? What do we need to do? What are your goals that you need to achieve as an employee that'll support that larger objective? And then providing the timely feedback to help people improve their performance. So I really think that managers need to think a lot more like coaches. The coaching model works pretty well. If you think about it, and I'm going to use basketball as an example. If a player is not doing something right, say maybe they're shooting free throws during a game, but they're not holding the ball as they normally do, they're not using good technique, the coach is not going to wait till the end of the season and give the performance review to the athlete and say, by the way, a few months back I noticed you had kind of shifted your free throw shooting style and to a much less effective strategy. It's kind of absurd to think about that. It's even kind of unlikely that the coach in most instances will wait until the end of the game to cover that. Probably the next time out or next huddle, the coach is going to be saying, hey, you watch out for this and keep doing what you're doing. You need to watch your hand. It's shifting around when you're shooting free throws. So that constant, and managers can't do constant feedback, but frequent, timely, quick feedback so that people can shape up quickly. It's so much better for the employee. You can address the issues before they become bigger issues, before people are upset about them. Gives the employee a chance to improve in a timely fashion well before performance ratings will be given out. So try to be more like a coach, and coaches are pretty assertive. They don't hold back with the feedback. They give feedback that's needed with the ultimate aim of improving performance. There's some mean coaches that kind of berate. I don't feel that they're necessarily a good model. Just more the model of quick, useful, developmental feedback that's timely and aimed at improvement rather than criticism or destructive criticism. Okay, I would like to talk a little bit about goal setting. Goal setting feeds into this chapter certainly because a lot of performance management is based on setting goals. Generally, it's good to set goals in a participative fashion with employees, so can't always do that. Sometimes corporate or the boss's boss sets the goals and you know what you've got to do, you really don't have a choice. But when possible, involving employees in the goal setting. Sometimes employees actually will set goals higher than you would, so you might have to ratchet those down, or you might be surprised that employees are thinking they can achieve some higher levels of performance than you thought, and maybe that will help you indeed reach higher level goals. But anyway, employees do tend to accept goals more when they have some input into the goals. Goal setting is an extremely powerful performance management technique and a performance improvement technique. Many of you have probably experienced this in your own life. I sometimes use goal setting, and it tends to work pretty well. I don't do it all the time because I sometimes don't want to commit to a goal, because once I commit, there I am, my ego's on the line. But that's one of the beauties of goal setting. It does tend to focus attention and generate commitment. Which is better, to do a goal that says, I'm going to do my absolute best on this, or to set a more specific, challenging goal that lays out what you want to achieve precisely? Hopefully by now you've either learned or discovered for yourself that typically specific goals tend to work better than the do my best goals. For some reason, it's so much more effective to have a target that you're shooting for. And even if you don't hit that target, a lot of times you're going to exceed what you would have done if you'd have stuck with that, I'm going to do my best on this goal. It's just something about human nature. I'd like to point out that goal setting improves performance in a number of ways. So you can tell I'm trying to sell you on the importance of using goal setting, trying to convince you that it's a potentially powerful technique if it's used correctly. So goal setting improves performance because it directs attention. We now know what is wanted. We know where we're headed or what we hope to achieve. So a specific goal directs attention. I know when I worked in industry, we had management by objectives, especially at Westinghouse was a big believer in MBO. There's been a lot of criticism at MBO, management by objectives, through the years, but it's a pretty solid technique, and one of the beauties of it is that participative goal setting at the beginning of the year with the boss. And then if you don't throw those goals once they're set in the bottom of a drawer or at the back of the computer storage space, if you have those out where they're periodically reviewed or have them pop up on your group-wise calendar every so often, it does direct attention. It reminds you of what you're supposed to be working at, because what happens in the workplace? A lot of competing stimuli. There's a lot of things hitting us, a lot of distractions and diversions, a lot of fires crop up, so having goals that you revisit every so often kind of redirects you to, I know all this other stuff is going on, but I've got to carve out time on this. This is important. Goal setting also clarifies what is expected, and that is quite important for management and effective performance. So they do clarify what is expected, especially if they're properly written, descriptive, if possible, quantitative, can be quite helpful about what is expected. Goals mobilize effort. So once you have the goal set, people know that they're expected to achieve it. Hopefully they buy into or support the goal. That's going to mobilize effort toward a goal attainment. And then they foster persistence. A lot of times people will persist toward even a difficult goal because, again, I don't know what motivates you, but certainly the first thing that comes to mind for me is the ego's on the line, or just the self-satisfaction. It's a pretty satisfying thing to attain a goal, especially one that's been made public. Public goal setting is pretty powerful. A lot of times if you want to maintain more persistence toward a goal, don't keep that goal to yourself. Share it with others. That, again, brings the ego into it. And I know personally I tend to want to persist longer and work harder to reach a goal that I've made public or shared my goal with other people. I would like to point out there's, I think Cassio's book is a good, really good textbook, and there's a couple sections in this chapter that are just literally a gold mine of useful tips. So you may see other parts of the chapter where you notice things that I don't notice. That's great. That's the beauty of having multiple minds in this course. Multiple minds reading the textbook, because you'll spot useful tips that I don't spot, and hopefully we can share those with each other. But Cassio's sections on define performance and facilitate performance seem to be gold mines of useful tips for future managers to me. The sections on define performance and facilitate performance, you might read those especially carefully for tips or things you want to do as a manager of employees. Okay, Cassio quotes a couple more statistics or survey responses in this chapter, and he said one of the items from a survey was my last raise was based on performance. So this would be employees saying whether they agreed, strongly agreed, or disagreed with the statement, my last raise was based on performance. And only 46% of managers agreed with that statement, and 29% of employees agreed. So only 46% of the managers responded that yes, my last raise was based on my performance. That's not good, I think. I don't know why the employee number, that 29%, was so low. I hope some proportion of that was due to employees that maybe work for a union or some other, belong to a union, or have some other sources of raises that aren't performance-based, but that's not a good number either. Even employees should have some of their, lower level employees should, in my opinion, have some of their pay contingent on their own performance or the performance of the organization, or both. So I think the management, the 46%, certainly bothers me. So I know some people will tend to use external locus of control or try to blame other people for their shortcomings. So there might have been a small, hopefully a small percentage of the managers who were saying, my last raise was small, and it's because my manager doesn't appraise my performance fairly. There's a few mean managers like that, but I think a lot of times if you're not getting the performance rating you want, you kind of have to look at yourself first before you start pointing the finger at the boss. Look at what you could do differently, even if it's a tough boss or a kind of a mean boss. You're going to have to adapt as effectively as you can, but certainly if the managers are legitimately saying that my last raise wasn't based on performance, that really undermines the whole ability to motivate and manage performance in organizations. I remember when I was working at Westinghouse, we had to take on a pay freeze. I think it was a 1-year pay freeze, and the managers were pretty upset about that. And what struck me is they weren't thrilled about their own pay freeze, but what was really upsetting to them is that they'd lost a motivating tool. So in other words, if employees know their pay is freezing, these managers were frozen. These managers were thinking, I just lost one of my most effective tool, because pay for performance or performance-based pay, merit raises based on employee performance are a pretty potentially powerful motivating tool, and these managers were pretty upset to lose that tool. So I thought that gave me some insight into the value that a lot of managers place on that motivational tool, and it should be used and used effectively. So that perception, you need employees to perceive that what I do here in terms of performance affects my pay outcomes. Otherwise, you're missing a huge motivational tool. All right, I'd like to touch a little bit on tips for avoiding legal difficulties in performance appraisal and highlight several tips for avoiding that. One of those is to establish a system to detect potentially discriminatory effects or abuses of the appraisal process. Right, so there are personal biases that can enter into performance appraisal processes. I think we've talked about that before. We all have biases and stereotypes, some of which we might not even be very aware of, that could influence how we rate others. That's unfortunate, but it's true. And we need to guard against those at the individual level, but I think even more so, I think it's kind of important at the organizational level that that's checked for on occasion. And what I mean by that there are experts that could review your performance appraisal process and the outcomes, the data or performance ratings that result from your system, and look for problems. Many of these problems will be sneak in non-overtly, in other words, they'll be unintentional. we've talked about how there's multiple contaminants that can affect the performance appraisal process. So we want to see if those are indeed having significant effects on maybe the raises that employees receive or the performance ratings that they receive. And so statistical analysis can be used to do that. And I know that sometimes the results are surprising from that. I think another tip for avoiding legal difficulties with performance appraisal is to have formal appeal mechanisms. So this should be a situation where if an employee feels that they were rated unfairly, it needs to be spelled out ahead of time. What does that employee do? What are the optimal strategies to pursue? Who do they appeal to? What do they do first? Ideally, probably talk to the boss that gave them the rating. They don't attain the satisfaction that they're looking for. Where do they go from there? Is it the boss's boss? Is it HR? Probably a flow chart spelled out on what they do and included in as part of the performance appraisal process or orientation or some form of training where employees know that that appeal system is there and more or less how it works, or at least how to access that procedure when they need it. I think also coupling that with higher level review of appraisals is essential. So I think that before any manager sits down with an employee to go over a performance appraisal, that manager should have talked over the performance appraisal with his or her boss. So if I'm about to be rated or given a performance appraisal by my boss, before my boss ever talks to me, my boss should have sat down with his or her boss, gone over my performance, talked over how they rated me, reviewed that. Why? Because the boss's boss, in many cases, will have more experience at this, will be able to function as kind of a check and balance to see if the accuracy is there, if the completeness is there. That boss's boss, and not in every case, but in many cases, is going to be able to improve the content of the performance appraisal. Maybe challenge a rating that's too high or too low. Probably help create a more accurate and thorough, comprehensive performance appraisal. And I think actually if I have to review the performance appraisal I'm about to give to an employee with my boss, I'll probably do a better job on it because there's some rehearsal in going over it with the boss. I might learn a thing or two, even find out some different ways to communicate the information. Plus, I'm going to probably put more time into the performance evaluation before I show it to my boss. And that's one of the main complaints that I hear from employees, is that their boss either totally neglects this performance appraisal process and doesn't do it, or they do it way late, or they do it sloppy. So I think this solution of one level up, reviewing the performance appraisal before it's given is a pretty important thing. And then back to the other tip about making sure there's an appeal procedure. You want a safety valve or escape valve. Like on a steam engine in the old days, those things could tend to build up too much pressure if they weren't regulated properly, so there would be an escape valve that would let off the steam before the whole thing would blow up. We don't need any more workplace violence or angry employees, so I think it's going to enhance perceptions of procedural justice. It's going to enhance acceptance of ratings if there is an escape valve for people who feel that they've been treated unfairly during the performance appraisal process. It's a good thing to have, these escape valves or procedures. I think sometimes things don't work out. Not every employee is a fit for the organization. Not everybody can do the job that they were hired to do. So it's going to be really important to document the appraisals and the reason for any termination decisions. So we need to do performance appraisals on a regular basis. We need to do them on time. We need to do them thoroughly. We need to put down accurate information. If the person's not doing their job, we can't just say a lot of good things in the performance appraisal to make the employee feel good and avoid conflict. We have to step up to our role as a manager, be assertive, be accurate, have the difficult conversations with the employee that's not performing effectively, document that as it should be, or it's going to cause a world of problems for the organization. That's the kind of thing that HR people certainly can help with, but ultimately the line manager is responsible. If they neglect their duty to give accurate performance appraisals, the time's going to come when they have so many problems with an ineffective employee, they're going to go to human resources or the owner of the company and say, this person's got to go, they're causing too many problems, they're going to shut us down, we're losing money, they're costing us, they can't do their job, and either the owner of the company or HR or the legal consultant that's hired in to help is going to say, look, you cannot fire this person right now. Your last performance review here, you're saying they're a good performer. We're going to end up in court and we're going to lose. Look at this documentation you produce. It has none of what you just described to me about the ineffective performances here. Why isn't it here? So we're going to have to start at ground zero and build our case, and that's going to take a lot of time. So I'm sorry, boss, you're just going to have to live with this ineffective performer until you do your homework. So you don't want to be in that position. It is uncomfortable dealing with ineffective performance in an assertive, accurate manner, but it's going to pay off in the long run, and it's a part of the manager's job. So really it's something that we've got to do. So if you end up in court, it's a godsend, or it's a very helpful thing if you've done that documentation as you should have. If you don't have an HR professional at your company, there are articles on this. There's probably hundreds of articles in HR practitioner journals about how to properly document before termination to make your case in the documentation. So, and there's probably consultants and other people who can help you through this. So really there's no, it needs to be done right. There's plenty of help available. So I think certainly you can do it. I think one of the keys of the chapter is to define performance, and I think making it clear what you want from employees is important. So that's going to reduce the role ambiguity. In other words, what am I supposed to do on this job? What does my boss expect? Those kind of things are stressful. So if you can make it clear what you want, that's incredibly helpful to employees. And again, back to the coaching model, be quick about it, be clear. Coach people, help them, and steer them toward effective performance. Guide them toward that. So make it clear what you want. Don't play the bring me a rock game. Have you heard of that? The bring me a rock technique of management. It's kind of like either it's a kind of warped game that you play to see what employees are made out of for some stupid reason, or you're just not an effective communicator. You give an employee an assignment or give them a task, and they bring you a product or idea, and you say, well, that's not really what I was looking for. I was hoping for something a little bit bigger. So they'll get a bigger, this is a metaphor, they'll get you a bigger rock. Well, not quite that big, so they'll get you another rock. Now it's too small. So they waste a lot of time, they encounter a lot of frustration, probably thinking some nasty thoughts about you as the boss. So just back to the clarity. Be as clear as you can, and if you're not very clear orally, try to convey it in writing. Do whatever you got to do to get your idea across of what is expected. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment related to setting expectations about what's wanted. I'd say encourage performance. So again, that's back to the coach. Coach people. Help them attain performance. Give them support and push up their morale when it needs it. So encourage performance, reward it, make it fun when people achieve things, celebrate when goals are attained. Kind of keep, if you can, an upbeat environment that encourages high-level performance and makes high-level performance kind of the expectation, the standard, but also something that is celebrated and supported. Evaluate performance. So record how employees are doing during the year. You can't document everything. If you do a once a year, some companies do more frequent, and that's probably even better, more frequent performance appraisals. But it's going to be hard to remember everything at the end of the year. So I know for myself, personally, for my own performance appraisal, I keep records. I try to keep records every week on some things that I do, because I know in professors we have to write up a lot of what we did for our performance appraisal, and it's amazingly difficult if you go, okay, what did I do a couple semesters ago? A lot's going to fall between the cracks. So as boss, my point is try to maybe use your group-wise calendar, create some kind of prompt that will pop up into your calendar every so often and say, document what your employees have been doing, highly effective behavior, ineffective behaviors, capture that, the achievements, things like that in writing periodically through the year. Even if it's just a short burst of activity, 15 minutes, 1 hour a month, something like that, to get that information down so that you're not struggling at the end of the year. It's really going to increase the accuracy and the effectiveness of your performance appraisals that you give. Okay, back to defining performance and also assessing performance. I'm kind of a pretty strong supporter of management by objectives, but whatever works for your organizational culture, whatever method works. One performance appraisal tool that I like is behaviorally anchored rating scales. Call them BARS for short. That's the acronym for the behaviorally anchored rating scales, BARS. I like them. They do have, let's start with disadvantages of BARS. They're time consuming to construct. So generally you'd have to get some subject matter experts, people that know a lot about the job, multiple people in a room, define the performance dimensions, and then come up with what does each level of performance look like behaviorally. So you might take a look at in the textbook and maybe even a web search for some examples of behaviorally anchored rating scales. There's some pretty poor examples out there that I've seen when I've done my own web searches, but these things are difficult to construct, and each different kind of job, different occupation is going to have different, slightly differing performance dimensions, so that would be quite a few scales to have to create. However, I think there are some core competencies or core dimensions that could run across any job in the company, for example, working with others or teamwork. Certainly, I would think that would be a performance dimension that you could evaluate a very senior manager on, all the way down to the lowest level employees. Almost anybody, that should be part of an employee's job, and so a behaviorally anchored rating scale, even though time consuming to create, for a core competency like that might be extremely useful and pay off development. The advantages of BARS, why I like them, is they help bring more inter-rater reliability. So if you and me were rating the same person's performance, our ratings would cohere more, they would be more consistent. We'd be more likely to rate that person the same or similar ratings using a behaviorally anchored rating scale than we would if we were using just one of those graphic rating scales that says, all right, rate, let's pick a performance dimension, quality of work, outstanding, excellent, good, satisfactory, poor. No definition of what outstanding, excellent, good, satisfactory, and poor look like. Just check the box. Was the quality of work, quantity of work, teamwork, excellent to poor, right? Outstanding to poor. Check the box. You and I will have a lot more variance in our ratings. A lot more idiosyncrasy will creep in. There'll be a lot less coherence in our ratings for that individual with a scale like that. So the behaviorally anchored rating scale makes it a bit clearer to the rater what each level of performance looks like. Another advantage, and I'm not going to talk about this much longer, I think not necessary to, but one of the underappreciated beauties, I think, of behaviorally anchored rating scales is for a newcomer, a person new in a job, if part of their orientation or first couple of visits with the new boss, they get a chance to take a look. Here's what we'll be rating you with. Here are the performance dimensions. Here's the scales that we use to rate performance. And they look at that. I know me as a new employee, if I've been able to look at the top end of the scale and go, if I want this high level rating here, these are the kind of behaviors I need to do. Here are the things I need to do. And down here at these bad ratings, here are the kind of things I don't want to do. So they're behaviorally specific. I think it would help me move quicker toward the bullseye about what's expected if I had a chance to take a look at something like that. Okay, let's shift gears to who should evaluate. There's a bit of information on that in the chapter. Who should do the performance evaluations? Obviously, supervisor in most instances, the boss, the immediate boss, is going to have a lot of insight about the job, about the person's performance. Yes, there's some exceptions to that where the boss is in another part of the country and rarely sees what an employee does, but I think, again, that is the exception. So certainly in most instances, the boss is going to be, in my opinion, the most valid source of performance rating, performance evaluation feedback. Peers, in many instances of peers, can be brought into the process. There can be some training associated with that so they know how to do it. I think 360-degree feedback is one technique that can be used. Why is it called 360-degree? Because ideally you're getting performance feedback from multiple directions. So from above, from the boss, maybe if you're a manager, you get feedback from below, from the people working for you, from your peers, the other managers at your level that you work with frequently, maybe even customers. So that's why they call it 360-degree feedback. This was a big deal when it was new in the 80s, and it kind of was really kind of getting big in the early 90s. So almost a management fad. It's pretty good. There's some well-designed systems out there. What's the problem with it? It's time-consuming, it's expensive. Most of the effective systems are through consulting firms, these big national performance management consulting firms that have a variety of tools, everything from selection tests to culture assessments to 360-degree feedback instruments. So they tend to be pretty well designed. So anyway, there's a lot of do's and don'ts on 360-degree feedback. So if you go down that route, be aware that it's expensive and time-consuming. It can be pretty useful, pretty effective, and there are some firms that have reputable systems for that. Self-evaluation, that's your call on that. What's your gut feel? Should employees or should organizations use self-evaluation as part of the process? So maybe I don't determine my performance rating, but I rate my performance, and I do that before I discuss it with my boss. I don't like them too much, but I'm well aware that a lot of organizations believe in them and like them, and I've talked to some managers who use them and know how to use them effectively and gave me convincing arguments about why they like to use them. So I'm not saying don't use them. I'm saying I don't like them because I think too many self-biases creep in, and a lot of times I think I've done them once or twice too in my prior careers, and it seems like a lot of employees, it feels kind of gamesmanship, like, I'll rate myself a little bit lower here because I don't want to seem like I've got inflated self-perception. So there's like, I bet the boss will rate me here, so maybe I'll rate myself there. Probably not everybody does that, but some of it does go on. So if your company's figured out how to use self-appraisals effectively, use them. There's probably some lessons learned on that out there too. Probably not a whole lot written up on that, but those are my thoughts on self-appraisals. Customers use them when it makes sense. For some jobs it's pretty darn informative, and I think customers can give you some insight into dimensions of performance that you might otherwise overlook or not be aware that were so important. So I know I've seen that on occasion where that customer perception about what is important from a particular job or occupation can be very eye-opening. So consider them as a source of feedback. I believe Casio lists computers as who should evaluate as one of the options. Computers, I think what he means is performance monitoring, electronic performance monitoring. That can be helpful too. A lot of lessons learned on how to do that effectively. If you introduce electronic performance monitoring into the workplace, be careful. Don't rush. Make use of lessons learned. One of the big lessons learned is to involve employees in the process before you think you have it all figured out. Involve them in the decision making and the planning up front, not in a disingenuous way, in a genuine way where they help you select the system, the procedure, how it'll be used. It's going to enhance trust, because otherwise if they find out this new performance monitoring system's coming in, they're going to think a lot of employees are going to be, I don't want to say paranoid, but hyper concerned about it. A lot of rumors, a lot of fear, a lot of stress. So there's quite a bit that's been discovered about how to do this, and it can enhance performance. And some of your most effective performers will welcome the technique because they'll be thinking, hey, now management can actually see what a good performer I really am. But definitely has to be handled carefully. New managers, I think there's a self-efficacy issue. So self-efficacy, to what extent do I feel I can perform this task that I have to perform? If I have high self-efficacy, I'm confident I can perform this task. If I have low self-efficacy, I'm doubtful that I can execute this task effectively. I think this is particularly relevant for performance appraisal. New managers I don't think any boss, there's hardly any bosses that like doing performance appraisals. They avoid it, like them. Talk to plenty of bosses that avoid it, and just, it's one of the least popular things bosses do. But I think particularly with most new managers, there's a confidence issue. It's kind of like you're judging somebody else for the first time, and you may not have as many benchmarks for these people you're evaluating. What does truly effective performance look like? You don't have as much time to have observed numerous people in that role, so you don't have as good a frame of reference. So I think helping new managers develop their self-efficacy. How do you do these performance appraisals? What are the standards and frames of reference I can use? So I think that's where some of the more experienced managers can mentor and help. Training can help. The boss's boss can help. So really, I think that would be important. If you're in that position and don't feel comfortable, I would say talk to some people, read some literature, talk to some more experienced managers. Be open. You don't have to say, I don't know what I'm doing, I'm scared. I tend to be an open person. I might say something not exactly that, but be pretty open about it. You can be more guarded if you'd like, but get the help that you need. Build that self-efficacy, because lack of confidence is going to come across in that appraisal session with the employee. You want to be prepared, reasonably confident, and ready to go. So I think practicing, maybe even asking another manager to role play. If you think that you're going to have a difficult performance appraisal with one of the employees, certainly some rehearsal and some practice, some role playing with an experienced manager would be wise. And then solicit the coaching that you need. I want to touch on a couple more things, and then we'll conclude with chapter 9. One is there was a classic article in Harvard Business Review, and I'm not going to talk about it too much, but there is the dilemma with performance improvement, performance management, that in most organizations the boss does the performance rating, so they have to judge performance and attach a label to it, but they're also responsible for coaching and developing employees, so it's called the dual role. And it was argued that by one researcher that this dual role doesn't work real well in his opinion. It's role conflict. I'm supposed to keep an open relationship with you. You're supposed to talk to me about your issues, challenges, problems, so I can help you. And I'm supposed to coach you, have this positive relationship. Yet I also have to judge you. And so those kind of pulling, this guy argues, in a couple different directions. So it is a bit of a dilemma. That's something you'll have to grapple with. I think that constant feedback, the coaching model, making it clear where people stand in terms of performance so that they're not surprised at the end of the year when that performance rating is given, is probably one of the keys to this. And then just having the employees know that hopefully you're on their side, right, that they trust that you have their best interests at heart, even if that means being pretty aggressive in terms of helping them and working with them when their performance, and even talking pretty frankly with them when their performance isn't where it should be. If they know you have their best interests at heart, they're going to be a lot more open to that. So, but definitely there should be absolutely no surprises at the end of the year when that performance discussion, the formal rating takes place. No surprises, else you have not been communicating and coaching performance as you should have been. And then, so part of that coaching process is giving feedback, And part of the performance, certainly the performance appraisal discussion, is a lot of feedback. So I'd like you to take a look. I have a document that I'll get to you on tips for giving effective feedback. And it's not a fancy document, but the tips in there are pretty darn solid. It's one of the best pieces of writing I've seen on this topic ever. And I think that's a big piece of our role. As individual contributors, we've got to give feedback that helps other people, constructive feedback, specific feedback. I think that's a lot of the keys. But take a look at the document, the tips for giving effective feedback, and put that to use, practice that. I think it will help you quite a bit if you can emulate those practices in your career.